1, verse 18. That's where we got to week before last. I thank Wayne for teaching last week while we were out of town. We took the grandkids on a little mini vacation while they were out for spring break. Thank him for filling in. He always does a good job anytime I'm not able to be here. So thank you again, Wayne, for teaching last week. All right, just to recap briefly a few things we talked about 2 weeks ago. Of course, we just got started into chapter number 21. Verse number 3, we saw where Paul and his company made their trip from Patara across the Mediterranean Sea to Tyre. That's about a 400-mile trip. And when they got there, verse number 4, the disciples there, they asked Paul, of course, not to go to Jerusalem. They were concerned about him and didn't want him to go because they had heard of what might happen to him once he got there. Verse 5, Paul, though, was determined to carry on. That's where he wanted to go, to Jerusalem, not to Rome, to Jerusalem. And the disciples and their families, it said their wives and their children, they actually escorted Paul to the ship, and they had a prayer meeting with him there before he left. Verse number 6, Paul and the company, of course, got in the ship, and they left, and the others, they went back to their homes. Verse number 7, we saw the next stop on their trip was Ptolemais. They only stayed there from 1 day, just a short trip, about 14 miles from Tyre to Ptolemais. And then the next day, verses 8 and 9, they went to Caesarea, about 38 miles from Ptolemais, so it wasn't that far of a journey as well. And once they got to Caesarea, remember, they lodged with Philip, the evangelist, and the deacon, and his daughters, and we talked a little bit about them. Verse 10 and 11, while he was there at Philip's house, the prophet Agabus showed up again. Remember, he showed up once before, earlier in the book of Acts with a prophecy concerning a famine. Well, he showed up and he gave Paul a dramatic example or a warning of him not to go to Jerusalem. He bound his own hands and his feet with Paul's girdle or his belt and told him the same thing is going to happen to whoever makes the trip to Jerusalem. Well, verse number 12, the disciples there at Caesarea, they begged Paul not to go again as well, just as the disciples did there in the city of Tyre. But verse 13, that kind of put Paul in a strait betwixt two. Remember when he was writing to the church at Philippi, he mentioned that. Well, he's kind of the same situation here, but he told them he was ready to die at Jerusalem if need be, if that's what it took, if that was what was the Lord's will would be. So verse 14, they all agreed that the Lord's will needed to be done above everything else, so they agreed to that. And so verse number 15, their next stop, of course, was Jerusalem, about 65 miles from Caesarea. That's where they made their stop. In verse 16, actually, some of the disciples from Caesarea went with Paul on this trip. So it had to be an encouragement to Paul for some of them to follow along. And once they got there, they lodged at Nason of Cyprus, his house. He had a house there at Jerusalem. And so they lodged with him. In verse 17, once they got there and got settled in, Paul had a time of personal fellowship with the believers there at the church at Jerusalem. So that concluded Paul's third missionary journey. It was about 4 years, 3,900 miles. Visited 27 cities, and of course all three missionary journeys combined is about 10 and a half years, about 8,200 miles. And he visited over 35 different cities in all three journeys combined. So now all three of his missionary journeys are complete. So that gets us to verse number 28 here. And verse 18, in chapter 21. And we see Paul now is going to deal with some of the things going on here at the Jerusalem church. Once verse 17, it was kind of a personal thing, just a little fellowship. But now things are going to get a little more intense here with the church once he gets there in verse number 18. So let me pick up here, Acts chapter 21. I'll read verses 18 through 26. And see some of the first things that happened here once he actually met with James and some of the elders here at the church. Verse 18 says, And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law, and they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Take them and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof thou were informed, they were informed of thee, concerning thee, are nothing, but that thou also thyself walkest orderly and keepest the law. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they have observed no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day purifying himself with them, entered into the temple, to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. So we see a few things here that happened once Paul actually met with the leaders there at the church. Back to verse number 18, it says, the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. So Paul and his company, they went to the church there, and they went to see James. Remember, James was probably still the leader here at the church at Jerusalem. We know he was the leader of the church back in Acts chapter number 15 during the Jerusalem conference. We discussed that and talked about that some. So they went to see James, but it says all the elders were present. Now, Luke does not tell us specifically who these elders were, but it could very well have been some of the original disciples or the original apostles of Jesus, because we do know that Peter was present in Acts chapter number 15 at the Jerusalem conference. Remember, he made a speech there during that time. So it's very well some of those the original apostles could have been present as part of these elders. Verse 19, it says, and when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his own ministry. So whomever these elders were, Paul greeted them. It says he saluted them. That just means he greeted them. And he told him all things that had happened to the Gentiles during his travels and his 3 missionary journeys here. And notice it said that he declared particularly. Now that means that he reported in detail, item by item, the things that had happened to the Gentiles on his missionary trips. Not things that he had done, but things that God had allowed him to do. Because it said here, it said the things that God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. So the Apostle Paul, he was just a vessel willing to be used, no different than any of us today, if we're just willing to be used of God and do what he wants us to do. So Paul, he was just a vessel, and he said, I haven't done these things, but God has allowed these things to be done through my ministry. So he tells them in detail some of the things that happened. In verse 20, it says, and when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. So initially they were excited to hear what God had been doing among the Gentiles here, and they had no problem with that, because remember, the relationship of the Jews as it had pertained to the law had been settled back at the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter number 15. Remember, they had written to the Gentiles about 3 things they need to abstain from, and we'll see that here later as it's repeated. They were to abstain from idolatry, they were to abstain from blood or things strangled, and then they were to abstain from fornication. And these were just 3 common sense things that any Christian should abstain from, and none of them had to do with anything about the law, because the part about the blood and things strangled, remember, that was pre-law. That was actually wrote to Noah after the flood. So they didn't have a problem with these Gentiles and the things that were going on with them. But their problem, the last part of verse number 20, was with the many thousands of Jews that had actually been saved. Because it says here that they were, even though they believed, they were still zealous of the law, and that means a fervent mind, or that means showing loyalty to. So, and we know that it took the Jews years to figure out that it was grace and not law, and it couldn't be a combination of the two. It was all grace and not the law. So they were still struggling with this part of it. In verse 21, and it says, "And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs." So their accusation was, okay, this man Paul, this Apostle Paul here, we've been informed that he was teaching the Jews to just stop doing everything when it came to the law, and to forsake all their customs that they had been handed down by Moses to their forefathers. And this was the same accusations that they placed on the Lord Jesus, when he was here during his ministry. They said the same thing about him, and even Stephen, prior to his being martyred. They were saying the same things about him. So it brings up the question, why were these, again, believing Jews? It says here that many thousands of Jews believed. So it's not talking about the unbelieving Jews. It's talking about the ones that did believe. So why were they still wanting to cling to the law of Moses? Well, it's just simple. I mean, old customs are difficult to change. If you've been taught something all your life, it's kind of hard to get away from that. And that's what was happening here with the Jews. We see it today as well. Sometimes it may not be, sometimes in our churches, it may not be about law and grace, because I think we've got that pretty much figured out, here in 2023. But, other things, maybe long-standing church traditions, if those change, a lot of times maybe people have a problem with that, because again, it's just change a lot of times is difficult. So that's why these Jews here, these believing Jews, they were still wanting to cling to probably the law of Moses. Now, I read a quote this week from a gentleman named Donald Gray Barnhouse. I'll be honest with you, I don't really know who he was, but I liked his comment he made. He said the book of Hebrews was written to the Hebrews to tell them to stop being Hebrews. And that's really what the book of Hebrews is all about. It's the old law, the old ways, the old covenant, versus the new and better way, grace, and the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's what the book of Hebrews is about. So I liked his comment there. So these Jews here were still struggling with still wanting to do some of the things contained in the law. Well, verse number 22, it says, "What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come." So these leaders, they were concerned that Paul's presence not cause a division or a disruption among these thousands of Jews that had believed. It said the multitude here, so he's talking about the thousands of Jews here that had believed. So they didn't want it to be divisive and cause trouble. So they suggested that Paul just demonstrate just some public reverence to the law and some things contained in the Jewish law, and that's what they did. Verse 23 and 24, it says, "Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they are informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, and keepest the law." So 2 or 3 different things here that they just asked Paul, again, just out of reverence to their law. They asked Paul if he would do these things. First, to identify himself with these 4 men that were apparently under a Nazirite vow. Back to Numbers chapter number 6, said they shaved their head. Remember, Paul did that himself back in Acts chapter number 18 when he was at Cenchrea. Paul did the same thing. So he asked Paul to go with these 4 men that had this Nazirite vow. And he also told them to pay for their sacrifices. It says here, verse 24, to be at charges with them. So he asked them to do that. And Dr. Schofield, if you see his comment in the middle of your Bible, if you have a Dr. Schofield, it says spend something on them. So he's talking about paying maybe for their their sacrifices, and also the last thing that he continued to be with them in the temple until the days of their purification were over, and that would have been 7 days based on Numbers chapter number 19. So just a few things here that these leaders here at the church just asked Paul if he wouldn't mind if he would do. And then verse 25, they start talking about the Gentiles again here in verse 25, as we've already touched on. It says, "It's touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication." So they reminded everybody that the Gentiles need not do any of these things. They'd already written to them in Acts chapter 15 from the Jerusalem conference to do these 3 common sense things that we've already talked about. Abstain from idolatry, blood, things strangled, and from fornication. Verse 26, "Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until an offering should be offered for every one of them." So Paul, he agreed here to what the Jewish leaders had said, and he had reverence to them, hoping that it would bring peace and not cause trouble, which we'll see here in just the next few verses that it didn't work. It still caused trouble, still caused a riot or a mob to be formed. But we got to remember now, Paul was doing this out of reverence. This was a matter of personal conviction. It had nothing to do with personal salvation. And we know there is a difference. Had it been a matter of any kind of personal salvation, there's no way the Apostle Paul would agree to it. Again, this is just a matter of personal conviction, and he did it again out of reverence. As a matter of fact, Paul never actually tells the Jews that it's wrong for them to continue to practice some of their customs so long as they didn't trust in those ceremonies. And they didn't trust in those customs or make those customs a test of salvation or a test of fellowship. And Paul makes that clear in Romans chapter 14 and 15. We're not going to get into that today. I've mentioned that before. But please take time to read those 2 chapters, Romans 14 and 15. And Paul makes it clear that you can't put any kind of traditions, ceremonies, customs, whatever it will be, you can't put that ahead of grace and ahead of salvation. It'll never work. So Paul reminds them, he tells them that, and again in Romans 14, verse number 15. So again, Paul here, he agrees to do these things. Well, next, and beginning in chapter 27, verse 27 through verse 36, we see Paul's arrest. And of course he knew, remember the Holy Spirit had been telling him, there's probably going to be trouble, there's probably going to be problems for him once he got to Jerusalem. And we'll see here that comes to pass here. Beginning here in chapter 21, verse number 27. Now before I read those verses, I want to read a paragraph out of this commentary I've been reading. And keep this in mind when we're talking about these next few verses about the things that happen next once Paul actually goes into the temple. Just again talking about the Gentiles and their place in the temple. So just remember this as we're going through these next few verses. In the temple, separating the court of the Gentiles from the other courts, stood a wall beyond which no Gentile was allowed to go. Now, Ephesians 2, verse number 14, the verse that talks about how the middle wall of partition has been broken down between the Jews and the Gentiles. Well, that was both literal and figuratively. We know the Gentiles were grafted in now and were equal to the Jews, but there was actually physically a middle wall of partition here in this temple. It says, on the wall was this solemn inscription, "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the sanctuary and enclosure. Anyone who is caught so doing will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." And that was actually written on the wall. What I just read was, so the Gentiles, they knew what might happen. It says the Romans had granted the Jewish religious leaders authority to deal with anybody who broke this law, and this included the right of execution. This law plays an important role in what happened to Paul a week after he and the 4 Nazarites began their purification ceremony. So just remember that, what I just talked about there. Just remember that during what is about to happen next in the next few verses. So let me take up here again, chapter 21. I'll begin reading verse number 27, and again, this starts the arrest here of the Apostle Paul. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews, which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. And notice, my Bible has parentheses here around verse number 29. It says, For they had seen before him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And of course, he was a Gentile. Verse 30, And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down into them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him, and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, and some another among the multitude. And when they could know not the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, Away with him. So we see here Paul's arrest, some of the things here that happened once he arrived at the temple. Well, back to verse number 27. Again, it says, After the 7 days were almost ended. These were the 7 days of purification we talked about, where Paul and these 4 Nazarites were entering the temple and waiting for their 7 days of purification. It says, The Jews, which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. Now, these Jews of Asia is talking about, there's probably Jews from Ephesus. Now, a lot of these Jews here now, though, these are some of the unbelieving Jews. They came from Ephesus, from Asia, and they saw Paul in the temple, and it says they stirred up the whole congregation. They stirred up the whole people. And we've seen that multiple times during Paul's missionary journeys, how these unbelieving Jews, from time to time, they would even go from city to city just to cause trouble, just to stir things up for the Apostle Paul, just to make things hard on him. So nothing new here that they would do that. And their argument, verse number 28, it says, Crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. So again, the argument was Paul was teaching against everything in the law and all the customs that they had known and they had been taught all their lives. And then it goes on, I already read verse 28, but then verse number 29 talks about how that they had seen him with this man Trophimus, who was from Ephesus. Remember, he's one that Paul picked up as a traveling companion back in Acts chapter 20. Verse number 4. So their assumption was that since they had seen some of these Gentiles with the Apostle Paul, that of course they had followed him into the temple. Again, it even names one here, Trophimus. We can see here, I guess, guilt by association. You've heard that term a lot, guilt by association here. They just thought that since Paul was in the temple and since Paul had these close Gentile friends, that maybe they were there too. Verse number 30, And all the city was moved, and the people ran together and took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. So this mob here grabbed Paul, and they drug him out of the temple for the sole intent to kill him. Verse 31, the first part, and as they went about to kill him. So, that's the only reason that they got Paul and they drug him out of the temple. They were intending to kill the Apostle Paul. You remember a definition? Benjamin Franklin's definition of a mob we talked about before. A monster, heads enough but no brains. Well, it's the same mob here, going on here, causing this trouble, causing this riot, just like they did back in Ephesus. Well, verse 31 goes on. It says, and as they went about to kill him, it says, tidings came into the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Well, word about this mob or this riot got back to the chief captain. Now, we're not told his name here, but he was Claudius Lysias, was this chief captain, and we'll see he was later named over in Acts chapter 23. Verse number 26, a word got to Claudius that all the city now was in an uproar, and there was a mob had gathered, there was a riot going on, and so he says, I need to step in and see if I can, stop this. In verse 32, he says, who immediately, as soon as he found out about it, says he immediately said he took soldiers and centurions and ran down into them. When they saw the chief captain of the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. So Claudius Lysias, the chief captain here, it says he went himself, said he took centurions and soldiers, possibly up to 200 soldiers here to stop this mob and this riot, and to get things back under control. It reminds us of the riot back in Ephesus, chapter number 19, where they all started crying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. We know about that when we studied that. Well, when the people saw he was coming to step in and to try to get control of the situation, then they stopped beating Paul. Says they left off the beating Paul. Remember, their sole intent was to kill the Apostle Paul, but when they found out that Claudius, the chief captain, was coming, they stopped beating Paul. Verse 33, then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. So he got control of the situation here with him and the centurions and all the soldiers, and he had Paul bound here with 2 chains, probably because he didn't really know who the Apostle Paul was. He thought that he was an Egyptian rebel wanted by the Romans who had caused a revolt. We'll see verse 38. He says, art thou not that Egyptian which before those days madest an uproar and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? So that's who Claudius thought this man, that Paul was at this particular time. So that's why he went ahead and had him bound probably with 2 chains. Well, it goes on, verse 34, it says, some cried one thing and some another among the multitude when he could not know the certainty for the tumult. He commanded him to be carried into the castle. So he asked the mob, what has he done? What has this man done? Who is he? What has he done? Well, they didn't know. Says they asked one, they didn't know. They asked another, they didn't know. It's just like the mob at Ephesus and back in Acts chapter number 19. Remember when they were asked why they were there, they couldn't even tell. They didn't even know why they were there. They just saw, well, there's something going on, it's something exciting, a big crowd, so we're just going to join in. Well, that's the same thing that was going on here. Again, Benjamin Franklin's definition of a mob. So he couldn't get an answer from these people as to what was going on. So he decided, he said, I'll just interrogate him myself. It says when he couldn't get an answer from the crowd, it says he commanded him to be carried, into the castle. So he had him taken from the court of the Gentiles. Remember, we talked about that a little earlier, where they could and where they could not go. There at the temple, he took him up the stairs, it says, to the castle. Now, this castle would have been like a barracks, like a military term, like the barracks. And it was a place that was well defended by the Romans. Remember, because this chief captain, he was a Roman. He wasn't a Jew. He didn't have anything to do with the Jews or their law. He was a Roman, and they were in control. I guess they were in police control, military control, whatever you want to call it. So he took him here up to the castle. Well, verse 35, 36, it says, and when he came upon the stairs, again, going up to the castle, said it was that he was born of the soldiers for the violence of the people, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. So Paul here, he still had to be protected by these soldiers, because the mob was still wanting to kill him. It said the violence, it said they were violence. It said the violence of the people. It's kind of like today, it's funny when you can't but laugh when you talk about these peaceful demonstrations that these people are having when they're burning everything in sight, but yet it's peaceful, right? Well, that's what was going on here. It wasn't peaceful, it was violent. I mean, they wanted to kill him, and they kept crying, away with him, away with him. They wanted him, the Apostle Paul, dead. So the soldiers here, they had to protect him when he was going up to the castle, going up to the stairs here. So we see here where Paul, he was arrested. Now in verses 37, 38, and 39, we see where Paul, he clears up with Claudius Lysias, the chief captain, on who he actually was. So let's read those verses. Verse 37, it says, and as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? Art thou not that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So verse number 37 there, Paul, he asked Claudius if he could have could he have a chat with him. He said, I need to talk to you. I need to clarify some things here with you. And Claudius here, the chief captain, he was amazed when he found out that Paul could speak his language. He could speak Greek, and he could speak his language. So that amazed him. Because again, verse 38, we've already talked about it. He thought... He goes on to tell Paul who he thought he was. He thought he was this Egyptian rebel that was wanted by the Romans. So Claudius just assumed that's who it was, and we know how that works, right? It's never a good thing to assume anything. We need to know the facts. And Claudius, of course, he didn't have the facts here. He was trying to find out, but the crowd wouldn't tell him. So the Apostle Paul here, he proceeds here, verse 39, to tell him who he is. He says, I'm a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. So he says, I'm just a Jew from the city of Tarsus, Cilicia. That's who I am. And he goes on here, the last part of verse 39, he says, I beseech thee, suffer me or allow me to speak unto the people. He says, I beseech thee. He says, I beg you to let me talk to the people myself. And so he lets him, as we'll see. We won't get into that now. It's time to stop. But we'll see beginning next week, Lord willing, beginning in chapter 21, verse number 40, Paul starts his defense. And we've heard a lot about that through the years. Paul, he defends himself, before the crowd and before Felix, and then later before King Agrippa. Several different people and groups of people that he defends himself with, and we'll see that, Lord willing, starting next week. And in his defense, we're going to see three different things he talks about his life and his ministry during his defense. So we'll stop here, Lord willing. We'll take up again next week, chapter number 21, here in verse number 40.